When we talk about modern Vietnamese history today, a lot of the time we get caught up on this, and not so much of this. Today, the latter is what we're going to be looking at. Few figures stand at the level of the late Ho Chi Minh when discussing Vietnamese history. Serving as the first Prime Minister of Vietnam, Ho was an integral part of Vietnam gaining its independence. However, a lot of his most well-known accomplishments, like his leadership during the First Indochina War and his position as leader of North Vietnam, came at later points in his life. In fact, when looking at his early life, many gaps exist in the legendary revolutionary story. What we do know, however, perfectly outlines the future works of one of history's most influential people. For the sake of today's video, we will be looking at a time span ranging from 1919, the beginning of his political relevance, all the way to 1930, when he founded the Communist Party of Vietnam, laying the foundation for the Viet Minh and Vietnamese independence. So, like I said, let's travel back to 1919 and explore. The year is 1919, and Ho Chi Minh is 28 years old, or he would be, if he was actually named Ho Chi Minh. At this point in his life, the man we now know as Ho Chi Minh was living under the name Nguyen Ai Quoc. Even this, however, was not his birth name, as he was born Nguyen Sinh Con, but per Vietnamese tradition was named Nguyen Tan Thuan by his father, a name meaning Nguyen who will succeed. In hindsight, Dad made a pretty good call. For the sake of simplicity, I will refer to him as Ho Chi Minh throughout the video, addressing which name he may have been operating under at the time. At the age of 28, Ho operated under the pseudonym Nguyen Ai Quoc, meaning Nguyen the Patriot. At the time, he lived in Paris as an anti-French imperial activist. In 1919, President Woodrow Wilson had released a call to action for self-determination among countries. When the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 took place, Ho took advantage and brought the demands of the Annamite people to the National Assembly and the French president. The demands called for political autonomy in Vietnam, along with other rights. Vietnam was not the only country to bring forth this kind of proposition to the conference, however, as others, such as Ireland, also requested national independence. However, Vietnam was rejected by the French, mainly due to the recent events of World War I. The French had lost a great deal of money during the war, meaning the economic support from Vietnam, as well as colonies like Cambodia and Algeria, would be very important for the country. While the demands themselves were not successful, Ho had established himself as a daring Vietnamese activist. However, while he was the one to sign the document as Nguyen the Patriot, his lack of fluency in French probably meant that Phan Van Trung, an older anti-imperialist, actually did the writing for him. Trung, Ho, and Phan Chu Trinh, another anti-imperialist, all lived in Paris together, doing their best to evade the Sûreté, the strict French police. By using a pseudonym, Ho had both frustrated the police with his appearance from seemingly nowhere and his bold demands of the French government. Following his submission of the demands, Ho began writing anti-French articles that began circulating through Paris's Vietnamese population. By January of 1920, the Paris Peace Conference had closed, but Ho grew steadily more interested in exploring his anti-imperialist desires. Continuing to use the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, he began attending meetings of organizations like the French Socialist Party and the General Confederation of Labor. However, he found that colonialism was often a secondary concern to these groups, and grew to believe that Vietnam needed to attract more attention to the issue of French colonialism. As he continued to attend communist and socialist-oriented meetings, Ho began to grow familiar with the ideas of Marxism, a subject that had been previously unclear to him. After reading Das Kapital, it is said that Ho slept with Marx's magnum opus under his pillow at night. No political work, however, was quite as impactful as Vladimir Lenin's Theses on National and Colonial. Not only did Lenin's views align with Ho's, the theses greatly improved Ho's understanding of Marxism. Following this, Ho became one of the founding members of the French Communist Party, and in 1921, after attending meetings of the Colonial Study Commission, which represented colonial subjects living in France, became a member of the CSC's Executive Committee. Unfortunately, as Ho's involvement and radical ideas grew, his funds began to dwindle, and he was forced out of his apartment with Trong Yen Trinh. Following this, Ho gained an apprenticeship as a photo retoucher. In February of 1922, Trinh suggested via letter that Ho should return to Vietnam to help spread awareness of Marxist-Leninism, calling Ho a fiery stallion. Said Trinh, "I am convinced that the doctrine that you cherish so much can be diffused among our people. Even if you fail, others will take up the task." Despite this message, Ho remained in Paris, founding the journal Le Paria to discuss news and opinions on colonialism. Ho worked with writers from colonized lands in Asia and Africa, much like the group in the Colonial Study Commission. In his writing, which he modeled after one of his favorite authors, Leo Tolstoy, Ho wrote with a blunt, straightforward style that he would carry with him throughout his career. This allowed him to communicate with the peasants and intellectuals alike. While Le Paria grew to be rather popular, the distribution was hurt by the Sûreté, who arrested anyone with possession of the journal. Ho remained in Paris while writing and working until June 1923, when he disappeared from the city and away from the watchful gaze of the French authorities. After receiving an invitation from Dmitry Manuelsky, an official of the Communist International, also known as the Comintern, Ho, under the guise of going on vacation, left for Moscow. While in Moscow, Ho delivered speeches and reports to the International Peasant Conference and the Comintern Executive Committee. Beginning in December, Ho also began taking courses at the Communist University of the Toilers of the East. While there, Ho studied mathematics, natural sciences, and continued to evolve his understanding of revolution and Marxist theory. Despite an engaging educational program, Ho was bothered by a lack of Vietnamese students, and advocated for the introduction of more Indo-Chinese students, a region containing parts of countries that we now know today as Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and China. By 1924, Ho had grown to be a popular figure in Moscow, taking part in groups such as Women's International, Red Labor International, and Youth International. Ho was also a speaker on May Day concerning worker solidarity and took part in the third conference of the aforementioned Red Labor International, where he spoke to the widow of Vladimir Lenin, Nadezhda Krupskaya. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of his work in Moscow, however, was becoming the face of the Eastern debate, arguing that greater Asian involvement was needed. While Ho felt he had grown popular in Moscow, he still desired to bring Marxist ideas back to Asia, and felt that doing so was the next step to create a revolutionary environment for Indochina. After receiving approval from the Comintern, Ho took a train to Vladivostok in October, and subsequently left via ship for Canton, China. Finally, on November 11th, the ship docked, and Ho Chi Minh arrived in Asia. The Indochina Ho returned to, however, was significantly different in political mentality than the one he had left many years prior. Following the arrest of his colleague and flatmate Phan Chu Trinh, a damper had been put on nonviolent Vietnamese independence movements. Following some failed uprisings and the imprisonment of the leader itself, the movement of Phan Boi Chau, a longtime friend of Minh's father Nguyen Sinh Sac, had similarly lost steam. Once he arrived in Canton, Ho got in contact with Comintern agent Mikhail Borodin, who he had met in Moscow. Living with Borodin and his wife, Minh adopted the name Li Tui and began working at the ROSTA, a Soviet news agency. While working for the ROSTA, Ho began writing articles, publishing his works in Moscow under the name Nilovsky. While doing so, he began the process of creating a communist party out of the Vietnamese population that was living in China. However, where leaders like Phan Boi Chau believed that the highly intelligent and educated were the key to the national revolution, Ho placed more weight in the actions of the working class and peasantry. Unfortunately for Ho, the Vietnamese working class was only about 2% of the population, and was spread extensively across Indochina. Additionally, very few Vietnamese were aware of the ideas of Bolshevism and Leninist Marxism to begin with, as French censorship had restricted not only the works of Lenin, but the distribution of Ho's journal Le Paria in Vietnam. Due to this, these ideas had not been introduced to the Vietnamese far longer than some of their neighboring nations, not even becoming apparent until after the First World War. Due to the lack of awareness in the Vietnamese population, Ho reasoned that he needed to create a party that both adequately represented Marxist ideas and also remained comprehensible to the working class. By December, Ho had contacted the anti-colonialist group Tam Tam Cha, composed of some of Phan Boi Chao's former followers. Through domestic terrorism and assassination attempts against French officials, Tam Tam Cha had worked with varying degrees of success to stir Vietnamese nationalism. After meeting the party, Ho was not only able to convert the members to his Marxist ideologies, but was able to come in contact with Phan Boi Chau himself, who recognized the son of his former friend and agreed to remodel his political party's approach. Unfortunately for Chau, Minh quickly realized that he and his older colleagues did not fit his vision. As such, Minh spent a majority of his time and energy on the younger Tam Tam Cha. From the members of the Tam Tam Cha, Ho helped to found the Cong San Don, the Vietnamese Nationalist Party. As a means of dealing with the spread-out nature of the Vietnamese working class, the party gathered individuals from several provinces, trained them in the ways of Marxism, and then returned them to their provinces to act as envoys of the party. In the spring of 1925, Ho and his colleagues formed the Vietnamese Revolutionary Youth League, an organization that proved to be key in Ho's long-term plan. The League was able to attract interest from Vietnamese workers and peasants, but arguably its greatest achievement was the idea of national independence. Back in Moscow and throughout the communist world, many began to call into question whether Ho had placed national independence ahead of his Marxist views, a criticism that had lingered for some time. In order to promote the Youth League, Ho and the League formed the Special Political Institute for the Vietnamese Revolution in Canton. In the school, young Vietnamese were brought to Canton and trained in similar ways Ho was during his stay in Moscow. Following their training, students either returned to Vietnam or continued their education in the USSR if they showed especially high promise. In addition to the SPIVRC, Ho continued to write while teaching, beginning the journal Dan Tien to publish the League's ideas, with a predictable emphasis on national independence. While in Canton, Ho also worked with the Indian Comintern M.M. Hua and Kuomintang leader Lau Shongkai to form the Society of Oppressed Peoples of Asia, with the first meeting being held in July in Canton. Jumping ahead to 1927, Ho had been living and working in Canton for 2 years now, but unfortunate events would soon cause him to go on the move again. Prior to these events, however, Ho published one of his most influential works, The Revolutionary Path. The pamphlet introduced many Vietnamese to the ideas of Marxism, and while many ideas, such as two-stage revolution, were quintessential Lenin, Ho had placed his own spin on them. For one, while Lenin envisioned a fast nationalist stage, the first of the two-step process, Ho appeared to desire a longer wait before moving to the world revolution stage. And, as always, Ho's appreciation of national independence far exceeded Lenin's. While Ho continued his work in Canton, inter-party conflict between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party of Sun Yat-sen, who had overthrown the Qing dynasty, began to escalate following Sun's death, whose survival and work with Mikhail Borodin had kept the parties in a fairly peaceful relationship. The man who replaced Sun, Chiang Kai-shek, was immediately suspicious of the communists and led an operation to gather up and execute communists in Canton. While Ho's friend Borodin left for Wuhan, Ho tricked French investigators and Chiang's forces by initially hiding out in Canton, but eventually taking a train to Hong Kong. In the process, Ho left behind Tang Chun-min, who he had married just months before. After arriving in Hong Kong, authorities began to grow suspicious of Ho, and he traveled by ship to Shanghai to evade detection. Then, to avoid the presence of Chiang Kai-shek's forces in Shanghai, Ho once again escaped by ship, this time to Vladivostok. Finally, after leaving Vladivostok, Ho arrived in Moscow in June of 1927. While in Moscow, Ho wrote to the Comintern, asking for permission and funding to be moved to Siam, where he believed he could be more effective than in China, where he was being pursued by Chiang's forces. Instead, he was instructed to go back to Paris and work with the French Communist Party to write a program for the Indo-Chinese Revolution. While on the way, Ho stopped in Berlin and helped establish the new Anti-Imperialist League. After arriving in Paris and working with the FCP, Ho headed to Brussels. While there, he attended a meeting of the AIL, along with notable delegates such as Motilal Nehru and Sun Qingling, the widow of Sun Yat-sen. By 1928, the Youth League had grown significantly, with 300 members in Indochina, During this time, however, Ho was in Berlin, living with a member of the German Communist Party for several months. In June, however, Ho left via train through Switzerland and all the way to Italy. After arriving in Rome, he made his way to Naples and eventually boarded a Japanese ship heading to Siam. In July, Ho arrived in Bangkok, but by August he had traveled to Bandung, along the way using the name Father Chin not to arouse suspicion. After his stay, Ho left in September and began the arduous trek to Udon Thani, a town of a large Vietnamese population. While there, Ho not only brought his messages of communism through plays and dramas, but he helped the Vietnamese grow friendlier with the nearby Thai population. Ho continued to travel on foot, all the way establishing new styles for the Youth League. In 1929, Ho traveled to Sakhon Nakhon, a town with an even greater population of Vietnamese than Udon Thani. However, he found that many of the people were not politically enlightened and lagged behind in many modern practices due to their heavy emphasis on Buddhist and Christian traditions. Ho helped introduce the people to modern medicine, all the way continuing to avoid the Shurete. By 1930, the status of the communist parties had begun to deteriorate, likely due to Ho's absence. Since Ho left Canton in 1927, arrests and failed uprisings had emerged from the Youth League and the CCP, and Ho Tong Mao was eventually forced to move the League's headquarters from Canton to Hong Kong. The appearance of other communist groups had also been a problem for the League, as the Vietnamese Nationalist Party, which emerged in 1927, and the Youth League began to form a rivalry, based on both ideological and strategic differences. The Youth League itself had split, with those more committed to Marxism conflicting with those who more valued ideas of national independence. By 1929, Tran Van Kong officially formed a separate organization from the group, dubbed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. While some members of the Youth League attempted to reunify the party, with figures like Ho Tong Mao reaching out to Tran Van Kong, the proposal was rejected, as Kong's organization continued to siphon members from the Youth League. Throwing their own hat into the ring was the radical Tan Viet Party, which renamed itself the Indo-Chinese Communist League. Like many of the members of the individual leagues, Moscow was furious about the split, but also emphasized that the only possible fix was a reunification of the parties. Throughout 1929, the parties continued to squabble, and wouldn't you know it, there was one guy who was perfect for the job and was just waiting for his chance. While in Siam, Ho heard of the split and attempted to set a meeting date, but members of the Indo-Chinese Party could not reach a decision and Ho could not get into Vietnam successfully. However, after a colleague explained the urgency of the matter, Ho stopped trying to get into Vietnam and instead left for Bangkok, taking a ship back to Canton. After some convincing that he could avoid British border police, Ho then made his way to Hong Kong. Arriving at Le Hong Son's apartment, Ho angrily spoke to League members, criticizing the split. Following this, Ho arranged a meeting for the parties to squash the argument in Hong Kong in January of 1930. While the ACP, formerly known as the Youth League, and the CPI had delegates come, members of the Indo-Chinese Communist League had been arrested on the way there. Nonetheless, the meeting continued. After introducing himself, he had been on the run for 3 years after all, Ho reasoned that the parties didn't need to combine, but instead each should dissolve and form a new group with new statutes and compromising ideas. Ho proposed the name Vietnamese Communist Party, and the Communist Party of Vietnam at long last had become reunified. While this certainly does not mark the end of Ho Chi Minh's political story, the establishment of the VCP set the precedent for all future operations to come. Not only had Ho laid the groundwork for future operations like the Viet Minh, he had once again established himself as the most important communist figure in Vietnam, and the rest, as they say, is history.